Welcome. We are back with Spiritwind. I'm Pam Hart, and I have my guest, Rick Wright. And if you remember, Spiritwind is a study group for spiritual adventurers. So we like to cover all types of topics in Spiritwind. Last month we touched on creation spirituality. So we're going to review that a little bit again today, and then get into women philosophers. So first of all, Rick, in reviewing creation spirituality, can you kind of tell us the difference between the fall and needing salvation and creation spirituality's view on that?
Yes. Most religions, Christian denominations that have derived originally from the Catholic Church, believe in the doctrine of what's called original sin. And original sin is the idea that when in the story of Adam and Eve, when they sinned, and then because of their sin, death came into the world, they found that more sins happened after that. They gave birth to their kids, Cain and Abel, and then Cain killed Abel. So it didn't stop. But it wasn't until St. Augustine, he organized the idea of original sin. And he said that basically that sin was passed on through reproduction, almost like what we would say today with genetics. And so that in reality, what that ends up saying is that a person isn't sinful because they've done wrong things, but they're just automatically born that way. They're born in sin, and that's why early on the church started baptizing infants, because they didn't want them to die in sin. So, but anyway, so creation spirituality takes a view of original blessing, what we say, and we focus on the first chapter of the book of Genesis that says that God created everything and it was very good. And so we look at the inherent goodness in human beings and in the world, and see that negative part of ourself that others say is original sin, as we use a term that's original woundedness.
So did the Jews believe in original sin?
No, it's not believed by Jews or Muslims, the Abrahamic religions, and there are a number of Christian denominations that don't believe it either, but it was kind of the majority opinion.
So is this kind of a part of liberation theology?
Only in the sense that historically, creation spirituality, the father of it was a Catholic priest and teacher in Paris named Pierre Chanou, Father Pierre Chanou, and he was the teacher of Matthew Fox, who is kind of the modern exponent or person that speaks out on representative for creation spirituality. And then Gudrez was another of Chanou's students, and he is the one that actually wrote the book Liberation Theology. But the different things, the thing they hold in common is that liberation theology was not focusing on personal salvation. Oftentimes today you'll hear people say, have you accepted Jesus as your personal Savior? And they feel like if you don't do that, that means you're going to go to hell. In liberation theology, there's talking about liberation of people, because it took place mainly in South and Central America, where people were being exploited, hurt, even killed by the regimes of the governments there. And they were thinking of kind of a social salvation. And in creation spirituality, we think a lot about environmental salvation. Of course, we care where people end up in the end after they die, but that's not our main focus.
So is this where the four paths come in?
Yeah, in creation spirituality, they speak of four paths, and they use Latin terms, but they're easily translated. Like, for instance, the via positiva, it just means the positive way. And the positive way talks about those times in our life when we're feeling positive. We look at the world and see with awe and wonder at the beauty of creation, the beauty of the sky and the stars and just everything. But most of us don't stay there all the time. So then there's the via negativa, or the negative way. And that's when we're going through times of grief and depression and mourning and sorrow, or even just times of aloneness, even if you want to be alone, but it's those times. And then the next is the via creativa, which is the creative way, or the path of creativity. And it has to do with the creative part of ourselves. And so often people think of creativity as being something that artists like painters and writers and musicians are doing, but creation spirituality says everybody has a creative part, whether it's the way they prepare food, whether they garden, whether even working on the car, or whatever they do. We use that part of our life as a part. And then the last is via transformativa, which means the way of transformation of self and society. That we want to transform ourselves into being the best kind of people and our society to be the best kind of place to live.
So following these paths is...
We see it not... In medieval times, the church taught that there were three paths. Purgation, illumination, and union. And purgation meant you would purge yourself of all things of the flesh, pleasures of everything. You would fast, you would go without sleeping, all these things. And if you got purged all the way, then you would come into what they called illumination. You would be illumined by God. Then you would be in that situation for years and years, and probably only at the end of life you would actually experience union with God. So creation spirituality does not see any linear thing where you're getting closer and closer to God. Rather, it sees life as a circle where we're in and out. Sometimes we're in close, sometimes we're not close, sometimes we're celebrating, sometimes we're creating. All of it, though, is part of salvation, not just an end result.
I guess that brings up the topic of death, too, and the recycling.
Right.
And
yes, because of creation spirituality's belief in, there's a term, well, if you buy the book, you can find out, deep ecumenism. It sounds like a big word, but really all it means, deep ecumenism means a movement that's taking place today, especially in creation spirituality, is pushing for it. But there are other groups that are doing it as well, and that is to not only tolerate other religions, but to be willing to learn from them. Maybe learning rituals they do that will help us in our practice. I know that Thomas Merton, a very famous Catholic priest, but he was a famous literary writer before that even, he ended up being a hermit, and but he was able to, what he did towards the end of his life was study meditation with Buddhist monks, because Catholics meditated, but he thought they were better meditators. So deep ecumenism means willingness to learn from other people and not just say, oh, they're from the devil and oh, they're a false religion and all that kind of thing. So we're very different in that way. But then when it comes to the afterlife, we don't hold any uniform view. Among creation spirituality people, you'll have people that feel that they just die and go to heaven, or other people might think they even in reincarnation.
Mm-hmm.
Matthew Fox, the foremost spokesperson for the movement, calls it God's recycling process, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever death and afterlife is, he just calls it the divine recycling process.
Yeah. Right. Well, and basically saying that God is in us and we are in God, and not just us, I guess
Everyone.
Living things.
All living things.
Even plants.
Everything.
And
everything in reality, the creation spirituality book teaches that everything that exists is in God, and God is in everything. So.
Oh, that's pretty good. Well, I think that's a pretty good review of creation spirituality.
Okay.
You have written a book about this also, which is available on Amazon,
Yes,
I believe.
Yes.
And so if anyone wants to find out more about that, I'm sure they can get the book. Our other topic for today is women philosophers.
Mm-hmm.
And in Spiritwind, we meet once a week on Wednesdays at Unity of Auburn, and each month we have a different study topic.
Yeah.
So May
Right.
will be women philosophers.
Right.
So I was wondering why women philosophers? How did that come up?
Well, initially how it came up was when I was in seminary, I did 2 full years of philosophy. Just studying with ancient philosophy, then medieval philosophy, then modern philosophy, then contemporary philosophy. I just read volume after volume on the history of philosophy going through. And the thing I noticed, I didn't notice it then, but a number of years ago, and I'll tell that in a minute, but I got in contact with a woman that had my same last name, and she was a philosophy professor. I just happened to bump into her on the internet, and we got to talking, and she let me know that there are a lot of women philosophy professors. And so I started doing research on it. This is a book that I use as a resource in this class. It's called The Philosopher Queens, and it's by, can you read? I can't.
Rebecca Buxton and Lisa Whiting.
That's right. That's exactly who it is. Anyway, so there were a couple other things that contributed too. One was I had studied early on about suffragettes and Young Women's Temperance Association or Society. Different women groups had tried to do feminist, or they didn't call it that in those days. It was just women's movement things. But what happened is right after World War II, there was just an explosion of women philosophers in France. They're French women, most of them, and they were talking about totally new things, and not just in France. And anyway, I'll leave it at that for now. Do you have specific questions?
Yeah, I know that one of your favorite people is Hildegard of Bingen.
Right.
And she's not very contemporary at all.
No.
But Could you tell us a little bit about her?
Hildegard of Bingen, she's the first person we're going to look at in the class, because I have a few people from ancient times. She lived in the 12th century, and she had been the 10th child of a family of 10, the youngest, and people think that their family gave her as a tithe to the church. And so she grew up she was what they called then an anchorite. And an anchorite was a person who, they're kind of like a hermit. They lived in a little house or a cell that was attached to a church building. And they had one window looking into the church so they could take part in services, but the rest of the part, they're just in there, almost like solitary confinement, you know. And they're dedicating their life to God by doing that. And so that's what she did. However, the abbess of the convent she was in was named Jutta, and she taught her, tutored her, so that by the time she turned 19, when Jutta died, then Hildegard became the abbess of the convent. Now, the reason why, you know, normally I wouldn't include a philosopher, you know, that's just a religious person like Hildegard, but she was actually what they call a polymath. And a polymath is a person who is genius in several areas. For instance, she was a painter, made many paintings. In fact, the painting on the cover of that book I have there is a painting that Hildegard made. And so she was a painter. She was a writer. She wrote many books. She wrote books on spiritual matters that touched on philosophical matters. She had books on visions she had, because she believed she had visions from God, and in a time when women got burned at the stake for saying the wrong things doctrinally. She came up before the Pope, and the only reason she survived and they accepted her as being a true prophetess, you know, her visions were true and everything, was Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. That I think most people have probably heard of Saint Bernard, at least the dog. But Saint Bernard of Clairvaux was a personal friend of hers, and he went to the Pope himself and argued her case to say that she was right on, you know.
Even though she was using herbal medicine and doing healings and writing about all of those kind of things.
Those things she was writing in Latin, which only men, priests,
could read
or write. So she had been taught Latin by Jutta. And so she wrote letters to the king, to the emperor, to the pope, everybody. She let them know what was going on. But besides being a painter and a writer, and she even wrote books on science, mainly in the area of healing, but they did experiments with different herbs and mineral things and that to see if they could heal. And they healed people that way. And there's a place in Germany to this day that still uses Hildegard's methods of healing. Yeah. And then lastly, she was also an incredible musician. She actually is the one who started the first notations of notes and things. And she did a whole opera, wrote a whole opera, and that was a morality play and so forth. But,
so a true polymath.
Yeah, she was a polymath.
Oh my goodness. Well, there are quite a few other women philosophers that I think you're going to cover. How about another one like Simone de Beauvoir?
Okay. Simone de Beauvoir was, and this is another problem about women philosophers, is philosophers kind of hang out with other philosophers. So you had what happened after World War II. I mentioned earlier that there was a kind of an explosion of women philosophers in France after the war. But they were all kind of attached to different men. So Jean-Paul Sartre, who was probably the most famous philosopher after the war in France, he was an existentialist, they called that form of philosophy. She was his partner. And they were actually partners for their whole lives. But they had an open relationship. Most of the time they didn't even live with each other. But they were always seen in public together. They always worked together and saw each other as partners. So because of that, a lot of times people focus on Sartre and they totally forget her. But in truth, when they went to school to go through the entrance exam for doctorate in philosophy, the highest test results for the exam, the entry exam, Sartre got number 1 and she got number 2.
Is that what led her to write The Second Sex?
I don't think it led to that, but she did end up doing that. And that's another thing I wanted to say. The difference between proto-feminism, I guess you might call it, the feminism of the suffragettes and the others, when it came to Simone de Beauvoir, she wrote this groundbreaking book. It was called The Second Sex. And it became a mass seller. You know, it outsold what Sartre wrote. His masterpiece was called Being and Nothingness. It's about 3 inches thick and almost impossible to read. And yet, she's very lucid. You understand exactly the point she's trying to make and what she's trying to say. And she's saying, what she's saying basically, and just in a quick nutshell in The Second Sex is, it's not anymore just getting the vote or doing this or that or having rights to your property and things like this. This is just being seen as a human being differently. We are not a second sex. We are equal, you know. And that's what she was trying to, and that's kind of what I believe kind of launched the modern kind of feminist movement, yeah.
So that was a really good one to be able to discuss all of her teachings.
And interestingly enough, you know, it's unfortunate, I guess, or maybe fortunate, depending on how you look at it. Simone de Beauvoir went through all Catholic school, you know, until she got to graduate school. She was in Catholic school. And after a life of being a Catholic, at the end, she was actually in her late teens, just said she's an atheist. Oh. You know, she didn't believe any of that stuff anymore. So,
interesting.
Yeah.
Well, another more contemporary person, Anne Dufour-Mantell.
Yeah.
I haven't heard of her.
She was a very young, again, French philosopher, and she focused, and this is something I wanted to read just a couple of lines out of this book here of the Philosopher Queens, because I think it points out the difference between women philosophers and men philosophers. This was talking about George Eliot, who's another person we'll be looking at, and she even had to use a man's name
to get published.
Her name was Mary Ann Evans, but she couldn't use that and get published. But anyway, it says, at the end of the chapter about her, it says, "The wisest philosophers are those who help us to see why life can be so difficult and complicated, and who situate moral questions where they belong, with the tangible human feelings and human relationships." And that's where it's very different. Male philosophy since modern time has been analytical. They've had what they call linguistic philosophy, where they just analyze words, the true meaning of words in a sentence, because since God doesn't exist, most of them don't believe God exists. There's no reason to talk about God. They don't think there's any reason to talk about the meaning of life, because that's something we have to create for ourselves, because there's no God that gave us a meaning, and all that. But the women philosophers focus on life. On life, not abstract questions of what is the true meaning of this word in this sentence. I mean, I've seen linguistic philosophers do lectures, and it looks like I was in school doing diagramming sentences again. It's, to me, absurd. To me, philosophy needs to address life, and that's what women philosophers are doing. The reason why I bring it up here is because Anne Dufour-Montelli, she was a French philosopher, and her philosophy focused on risk-taking. And risk-taking she saw as an important thing in life, because if we don't take risks, we don't go anywhere, And she was so, and I read a couple of her books, and she was so committed to that she ended her life accidentally trying to do that.
Taking a risk.
She took a big risk. There were some kids that were in the Mediterranean swimming, and it was a bad current, and it looked like they were going to drown, and she dove in to save them. And she did indeed save them, but she lost her life in the process.
Well, I think this has been a very interesting prelude to the classes that will be coming up in May.
Yeah.
So we're going to look forward to that. And we're going to remind everyone to join us at Unity of Auburn on Wednesdays at 5:30. And Unity of Auburn is on 1212 High Street. And just come. There's no charge for the class. And ask questions. Get involved. We look forward to seeing you. And thank you again, Rick.
Thank you.